Welcome to Unit 1.2. This is IBDP Economics. Today, we are going to focus on the three basic economic questions: resource allocation and output income distribution. You can see the four learning objectives below. So, what are the three basic economic questions? What, how much on the one side, how and for whom to produce. So these are the three basic questions you can see in the diagram below. What to produce or how much to produce? All economies need to choose the particular goods or services and the quantities that they wish to produce. Peru, for example, is a country that exports minerals. There are other countries that export or sell finance services. So they need to be clear on what to focus, what is more productive for them. The second question that comes is how to produce. All economies must make choices. So they need to know what resources they will be using in order to produce specific goods and services. So these goods and services can be produced having different combinations of these factors of production. For instance, relatively more labor with fewer machines, or relatively more machines with less labor. By using different skill levels of labor, by using different technologies, or by using different raw materials, for example, plastic or wood. So, number one, what to produce. Number two, how to produce that. For example, will these goods that will be produced are intensive in labor? Are they intensive in materials, in capital? And finally, the question for this is for whom to produce. All economies must make choices about how these goods and services produced are going to be distributed among the population. Are these products going to be exported? Is it going to be just for the local market? Should everyone get an equal amount of these? Should some people get more than others? Should some goods and services, for example, such as education and healthcare services, be distributed more equally? These are important questions that they need governments and need to establish from the beginning. Now, this brings to the topic of resource allocation and output income distribution. The first two of these questions, what to produce, how much to produce, number one, and number two, how to produce, are about resource allocation, while the third, for whom to produce, is about the distribution of output and income. Let's define resource allocation. Resource allocation refers to assigning available resources or factors of production to specific uses chosen among many possible alternatives. And this involves answering what, how much to produce, and how to produce questions. Let's have an example. If what or how much to produce choices involves choosing a certain amount of food and a certain amount of weapons, this means a decision is made to allocate some resources to the production of food and some to the production of weapons. At the same time, a choice must be made about how to produce, which particular factors of production and in what quantities. For example, how much labor, how many machines, what types of machines should be assigned to produce food, and which and how many to produce weapons. So the government needs to allocate resources. Think about a government that wants to focus on education and wants to focus on producing weapons. So should they allocate more resources to produce weapons, or more resources to produce perhaps a good quality education that is a service? So this is the first part. Resource allocation concentrates on two: how much to produce, one, and number two, how to produce that. If a decision is made to change the amounts of goods produced, such as more food and fewer weapons, so we have here an important term that is reallocation of resources. Sometimes societies produce the wrong amounts of goods and services relative to what is socially desirable. For example, imagine that in your country, too many weapons are being produced. Too many weapons. Excessive number of weapons. What is happening? What is happening then? There you have over-allocation of resources to the production of weapons. On the other hand, if there is a country that needs healthcare, needs education, but there are few services produced, few goods produced to provide good education and healthcare. So we can say that what is happening there is an under-allocation of resources to the production of this. So these are two important terms. On the one hand, over-allocation, when you have excessive production of certain goods and services, or the opposite, under-allocation. That means not enough production of resources. Here we have test your understanding 1.6. You can pause the video and read the questions. I will be providing the answers in the next slides. These are the answers for number 1 and 2. Test your understanding 1.6. You can pause the video, check and compare your answers. This, we have number 3, from A to F. You can pause the video and check your answers. Okay, now let's move on to another topic, that is alternative ways to answer the economic questions. Do you remember the 3 questions? What, how much to produce? Number 1. Number 2, how to produce it? And number 3, for whom to produce it? How can countries answer these questions? Well, countries around the world have differences. They have different ways in which they allocate and distribute resources. So they have a number of different decisions. At the heart of their differences lie the methods used to make the choices required by what, how much, how, and for whom to produce. So there are 2 important methods that can be used to make these choices. We have 2 methods. 2 methods for what? To choose. The market method on the one hand, on the other hand, the command method. So we have the free market and the central economy, okay? Free market economy on the one hand, and central planned economy on the other hand. So let's start with the first one, markets versus government intervention. This is a dispute between the 2 most predominant methods of making decisions. In the market methods, resources are possessed by private individuals, groups of individuals, that is, companies, okay? And well, consumers and firms. They are the ones who make economic decisions by responding to prices that are determined in markets. We are going to see more of that in chapter 2. So on the one hand, the ones that rule are individuals, the private sector, through consumers and firms. It is the market that determines the price of things, goods and services. On the other hand, you have the command method. Resources, capital, labor in particular, are owned by the government. So the government is the one that possesses resources. And they are the ones that make economic decisions. So the government makes economic decisions. This in practice involves having specific legislation and regulations, so that in general, any kind of government decision making that affects the economy. So we have the two sides. Now, but what happens in the real world? We don't have a country, an economy that is ruled entirely through its market methods. And neither do we have an economy that is ruled by, entirely by the command methods. So what happens with real world economies? They make combinations of market and command methods in different ways, in different proportions. Economies may lean more toward the command economy. For example, planned economies of communist systems. You have the examples of Cuba or North Korea. Or perhaps they can be more toward the market economy, that is a highly market-oriented economies, more like in the USA, for example. But whatever the case, over the past 40 years or so, there has been a tendency around the world for economies to trust more and more in the market and less on this command method. So there is a tendency of countries to be more reliant on the market. So when the government makes decisions that affect economy, we can call this government intervention, because the government is taking part, is intervening in the workings of the market. Examples of government intervention include provision of public education. If you see schools that are public, that has to do with intervention. Public hospitals, for example, public parks, road systems, national defense, flood control, minimum wage legislation, restrictions on imports, anti-monopoly legislation, tax collection, income distribution, and many more. So all of these are examples of what? Government intervention. Very important. Now, super important term, government intervention. So let me read this. Whatever the reasons for and types of government intervention in the market, government intervention changes the allocation of resources, distribution of output and income from what markets would have achieved working on their own. Now, it is suggested that you reread this section after reading chapters 2 and 4 to 7. Okay, so you will have in-depth analysis of this topic in the aforementioned chapters. The market and command methods to answer the basic economic questions discussed above can be thought as these two ideal types. A free market economy is based on the market approach, and the planned economy is based on the command approach. When I say approach, I'm referring to methods. So an ideal type 100% free market economy is just an abstract idea. So it does not represent the world. We do not have real examples of that. But it contains some characteristics, okay, that serve as a standard for comparison of real world situations. On the other hand, the same happens with the planned economy. It's an abstract idea and does not represent the real world. Now, it's important to note that in reality, economies make combinations of both market and command methods, and we can call them mixed economies. Here we have a graph of this. on the one hand, market economy owned by the private sectors, freedom to start business, supply and demand. Prices are determined by the market. That means supply and demand. On the other hand, command economy, that is owned by the government. There is government regulation and price control as well. So here we have a chart. This is based on the Oxford coursebook. You have a list of advantages, of disadvantages of pure free markets and disadvantages of planned economies. You can pause the video right now to read, and I will be giving you some sort of summaries for each of the points there. So you can pause the video now. The first disadvantage for pure free markets is that harmful goods can be commercialized. Number two, only few people will be able to afford certain goods under this method. High profits occur at the expense of natural resources. The most needed, people who need, like poor people, people with disadvantages, they will not be able to survive. There will be concentration of power by large firms that might result in monopolies. On the other hand, we have disadvantages of planned economies, misallocation of resources and shortages that results in inefficiency. Okay, resources will not be efficiently used. Workers will not have enough incentives to be productive. There is loss of freedom to choose, and the government becomes corrupt. So these are the disadvantages of planning. Now, let me move on to the next part. This woman that I am going to present, this woman is Kate Raworth. She wrote a book called Donut Economics, and I am going to be leaving her video. She participates in a TED Talk lecture, and you're going to be watching this video and you're going to be writing a summary paragraph with the main points that she states in this lecture. Now, let's move on to the next part. Test your understanding 1.7. You can take time to read and pause the video. Okay, I will be providing the answers for this. You can read question number 1, pause the video, and compare with your answers. You can do the same with number 2. You have the answers for this. Number 2, test your understanding 1.7, section 2. Pause the video and compare your answers with the ones in the slides. Now, let's now move on to economic systems: free market economy, planned economy, and mixed economy. The ideal type free market and planned economies are distinguished from each other on the basis of 3 criteria. The first criteria is resource ownership. Is it private or is it public? Ownership of society's resources can be public or private. The public sector refers to the parts of the economy that are under the ownership of the government. The government is also sometimes referred to as the state. So the private sector, on the other hand, includes the parts of the economy that are under the ownership of private individuals or groups of individuals. They include consumers, firms, resource owners in general, NGOs, for example, interest groups or stakeholders. And the free market economy has private sector resource ownership, in conclusion, and the planned economy has public sector resource ownership. Okay, so this is the first point to make. Economic decision-making. Economic decisions and choices regarding what to produce, how much to produce, how to produce it, for whom to produce it, can be made by the public sector. For example, the government or the private sector as well. So there are many private decision makers. The most important are these: consumers and firms, and of course, resource owners. So the free market economy has private sector economic decision making. Who makes decisions in a free market economy? The private sector. Now, what happens in planned economies? The public sector is the one that makes decisions. Number two. Number three, rationing systems. This is an important term. The term rationing can be defined as the method used to provide, to apportion, to divide something up between its interest users. In economics, this refers to the method used to make resource allocation and output income distribution decisions. So there are two ways, two systems: price rationing and non-price rationing. Let's concentrate on the two methods. The free market economy uses price rationing. What does that mean? So they do that to make resource allocation and output income distribution decisions. So that means that all economic decisions relating to what will be produced, how it will be produced, and who will receive the output are made on the basis of price of goods, services, and resources that have been determined in markets. So in the free market economy, if you see a kilogram of chicken that is $10, it's because that is determined by the market. How do you pay? Why do you pay $10 for a kilogram of chicken? That was determined by markets. Now, on the other hand, in the planned economy, they do not use the same price rationing. They use the opposite, non-price rationing, to allocate resources. And that means that all the decisions related to what to produce, how much to produce, how, and all that, they are not determined by prices. They are not determined by markets. They do not consider the markets. So this non-price rationing results when there are no markets. The governments interfere in markets. So in which case the government acts as a central authority. They make decisions. So that this is an important factor, okay? Rationing. Both price rationing and non-price rationing will become much clearer in chapter number 2. But well, to sum up, in the free market economy, households and firms, companies, the private sector, are the main owners of resources, as well as the economic decision makers. So the market and the private sector is the one that makes decisions about buying and selling, okay? and are linked together in product and resource markets. We are going to see that in chapter 2. Now, the planned economy, on the other hand, to sum up, is characterized by the absence of markets, no markets. So there is a very limited operation of markets. Now, as the owner of resources and economic decision maker, the government makes all allocation and distribution decisions through non-price rationing. This is called planned economy because the government authority makes detailed plans of all economic activities. So they decide how much to produce, what to produce, and they set the price, but they do not depend on the market. They may decide that the kilogram of chicken is $1. They set the price at their own convenience. Whereas, on the other hand, in the free market economy, the price of $10 says a lot because there is a lot behind it. The suppliers, the cost of bringing the material, the money that you have to pay to the workers, etc. The markets are the ones that decide that. So in these planned economies, we can say that there are very few countries in the world that are highly centrally planned, not at 100%, but yeah, as I mentioned before, North Korea and Cuba to a lesser extent. Most other countries have begun to introduce major reforms intended to strengthen the roles of markets. So as I said at the beginning, there is a tendency to move on to that trend, the markets. In the real world, virtually all economies combine elements of both markets and commands. Differences between actual economies lie mainly in the ways the two are combined and in the degree to which one predominates. So for this reason, most economies in the world today are called mixed economies. So some characteristics of mixed market economies. Well, in mixed market economies, public or private sector ownership and decision-making often go together. So it's a combination of both. Let's have an example. Privately owned firms usually make decisions about what and how they will produce and sell, while the government makes decisions about economic activities that fall under its ownership. For example, public health services, public road systems, public parks. So decisions that are made by the government may help firms and the private sector to keep moving and keep growing. They are all linked. So, for example, if there is an improvement in infrastructure of roads, that's going to be having a positive impact on the appearance of firms because they will be distributing their products more efficiently. But the government's decision-making role in the mixed economy, in the mixed market economy, is not limited only to activities falling under its ownership. It also extends into private sector activities. Let's have an example. In the United States, one of the more market-oriented countries in the world, they have government decision-making that affects the private sector in different ways. For example, minimum wage legislation. This has an impact on the private sector because you cannot, if I am in the private sector, I cannot pay my worker less than what the government says. Subsidies for agricultural products. Subsidy, an important term, subsidio in Spanish. A subsidy is a sort of help that the government gives to certain companies so that to be competitive in the market, especially against other countries. Tariffs on imports. This tariff is a sort of tax. In Spanish is arancel. So tariffs are important because they restrict somehow and help local businesses compete with foreign ones. Regulations of private sector activities, for example, anti-monopoly legislation, governments are making sure that companies do not have the 100% of the share market. Otherwise, that could result in the consumers paying more. Tax collection, increasing taxes, income redistribution, and many others. All mixed market economies, in fact, have government involvement. So all of them with the private sector that go together. Okay, so this is either a response of the failure of the market mechanism to work well, or in response to the demands of politically powerful interest groups. So you can see that in these two ways. We are going to examine government intervention in the market extensively in the chapters that come after this one. Well, we have here in mixed market economies, price and non-price rationing can be observed. So we have a combination of price rationing and non-price rationing. Price rationing arises in situations where there is a market of resources, goods and services. If there is no market, or if markets are not free because of government intervention, then some forms of non-price rationing happen. For example, when governments in market economies provide national defense, public healthcare systems, public road systems, and flood control, they do not rely on price rationing to determine resource allocation and output distribution. The role of the government agencies that plan and provide these services is similar to the role of the central planner. Consider the case of national health systems, where the government, through tax financing, undertakes to provide health care services that are made available to the entire population, or nearly free of charge, okay? Free of charge or nearly free of charge. Since there is no price charged to the consumer who receives a service, some mechanism other than price, that is non-price rationing, must be used to distribute the services among its users. The most commonly used non-price mechanism is waiting in line or waiting period. We have seen significant changes over time in the relative predominance of private versus public sector activities. So during much of the 20th century, many countries throughout the world saw major increases in government participation in economic decision-making. So since the 1980s, there has been a shift again in the direction of less public sector involvement and a corresponding growth in private sector activities. Well, this has to do with history, yeah, but from the 80s, especially the early 90s, we have clearly seen that a shift into market economies. In many countries around the world, including both developed and less developed ones, there is an increasing importance of market-based activities. Okay. Well, the market is the one that promotes growth. And well, this is the task 1.8. You can pause the video and read. And I will be providing the answers for number 1 and number 2. You can pause the video and compare with your own ideas. This is number 3 and 4. You can pause the video and compare with your answers. This is number 5, 6, and 7, please. Take time to pause the video, compare your answers. And finally, well, today we focus on 6 important terms: resource allocation, government intervention, free market economy, planned economy, and rationing. Do not forget to write down these terms with your own definitions, or definitions that are easy for you to remember and apply. Thank you very much for your attention.